Mr. Chairman, I am deeply grateful to you and the other members of this committee for offering me the opportunity to testify today on this extremely important agenda. Staff asked me to say just a word about my background. I retired a year ago from a 35-year career in serving the national security, 20 of it working for CIA. And in those years, I was a national intelligence officer for the USSR, now Russia. I was the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, which prepares national intelligence estimates. I had 2 tours on the NSC staff, one under President Carter, one under President Reagan, and I also served in private industry. Throughout that period, I was primarily focused on things having to do with the Soviet Union one way or another, and of course I continued my keen interest in Russian affairs after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'd like to focus my testimony on the larger context of Russian developments that have posed the challenge before this committee, the challenge of organized crime and its various threatening practices like money laundering. We can probably have little doubt that our law enforcement agencies and regulators will come to grips with this challenge. This committee will no doubt help in that endeavor. But we must keep the most important issues in the forefront, as the chairman has done in his public statements and in his very gracious and I thought very timely statement in the Russian language to the Russian people here today. We must consider how our country's future security and well-being will be threatened if once again Russia fails in its historic mission to find her way to authentic, stable democracy and a just, prosperous society with a market economy. My bottom line is that Russia is not lost. That's a straw man statement, as a matter of fact. We ought to ban it from the debate from now on, since everybody's attention has been got anyhow. Russia is stuck in a swamp between the Soviet past and several alternative future possibilities, some of them bright and some of them ominously dark. The larger purpose of these hearings in this committee and in other committees of the Congress, and in the debate now finally taking place in our political arena and in our press, is to understand Russia's condition and prospects better and to inform better American policies for encouraging the brighter prospects of democracy and Russian capitalism. The threat from Russian organized crime springs from 2 fundamental and interrelated realities. First, the grave weakness of the rule of law in Russia, and second, the perversions of what we have called economic reform. The communist system was itself a kind of structured lawlessness. The Soviet Union had lots of laws, but they were really tools in the hands of those who wielded power to use, abuse, or ignore, and they left plenty of room for ordinary crime, organized crime, and official crime, or what I call authorized crime. And these possibilities, of course, expanded massively and rapidly with the collapse of the Soviet order. The collapse of communist rule gave free rein to these phenomena in a completely new setting. Now, that new setting, which we've labeled the emerging capitalist economy of Russia, is something for which I've not found a good definition. It has important features of democracy and capitalism, but it is not authentic democracy or complete democracy, and certainly not authentic capitalism. Focusing on the business and economic side, I'd use the term crony capitalism without capitalism, or at least much capitalism. By capitalism, we mean investment for the building of wealth. That's not what was going on there. We see a lack of firm property rights and good corporate government. We see a system that is more about the distribution and especially the concentration of wealth than it is about investment and the creation of wealth. And above all, we see a system that is about the extraction and the expatriation of wealth. We have used the term capital flight here. I think we've got to have another term for most of this, because capital flight ain't what it is. It's the flight of loot rather than the flight of capital in many cases. And that's not just the criminal loot, but the plundered wealth out of the natural resource base. It isn't the same as a businessman in Brazil making a profit on a business and then sending that money abroad because it isn't safe or profitable at home. Now, Now, this came about in large measure because of the manner in which the reformers of the post-communist regime tried to create capitalism amidst the wreckage of the Soviet order. As one analyst I've read put it, they proceeded in good communist fashion to create a new capitalist class by basically appointing them. Relying largely on privileged insider relationships, vast resources and enterprises were placed into private hands, often the old communist hands, at less than fire sale prices. Enterprises were sold off at less than the cash value of their annual revenues. Export and import privileges were handed out to cronies like the sports fund. Even the church profited from this, alas. Thus, the process of privatization was from the outset a ripoff at the expense of the state and the society. This, along with the destruction, the unnecessary destruction of people's savings through inflation in the early 90s, deeply blighted the public's view of capitalism from the outset. The reformers took a course certain to alienate society. They almost deliberately ignored the task of building public understanding and support, a theme to which Congressman Weldon spoke when he referred to the importance of engaging the Duma. Dmitry Symes, known I'm sure to all of you who follow Russian affairs, tells a story of how on his last trip to Moscow, former President Nixon visited with President Yeltsin and urged President Yeltsin and the reform team to pay more attention to building public and Duma support, at least a dialogue in the face of mounting opposition. And President Yeltsin said, well, that's not what we're hearing from Washington. We're told we ought to just ignore the Duma and the opposition. This was in 1993. So the political, well, naivete is too good a word for it, but whatever it was on our part started very early. Now, this still might have worked out had the new owners, however privileged and unfair their access to this wealth, had they proceeded to manage their new wealth as real capitalists, as real entrepreneurs by investing, building, and creating, as our robber barons did, so-called. But far too often they did not do this. Lacking confidence that their new wealth could be profitably invested in Russia, or even if they could hold on to it, and not knowing, in most cases, how to turn resources into new wealth through investment and entrepreneurship, they all too often simply extracted it, stripped it, plundered it out of Russia, and sent it abroad, where it could be safe and productive with little work by themselves, other than financial and other kinds of bureaucratic machinations. In this matter, a country rich in national resources and productive potential saw its state and society impoverished. The society and domestic economy reacted with various coping strategies, barter trade, moonlighting work. The state had its coping strategies, like not paying its bills, and then very creative financing called the short-term capital bond market at high interest rates, which actually turned into a no-lose casino that had eventually to go bust, despite the lavish spending of the IMF to keep it up. What we've seen here is not so much organized crime as authorized crime intertwined with corrupt government and politics at all levels. It has been abetted and has abetted itself by organized crime with its money laundering, its protection rackets, and the like. The fundamental misdemeanor of Western, including American policy, was that it bought into this phony crony capitalism too uncritically and for too long. And against obvious evidence, you could have shut down all of Mr. Woolsey's colleagues on this front, and it still would have been obvious. Intelligence brought its own very special contribution, sources and methods of a sensitive nature, but you didn't need intelligence to see this. You needed an absence of intelligence, small I, to ignore it. But the government wasn't alone. The mainstream media, the mainstream foreign policy establishment up and down Mass Avenue ignored it as well. The protests of Russian and Western observers who knew what was going on went unheeded. One of the sad consequences was that IMF lending, while aiming to stabilize and grow the economy, actually lubricated and legitimized this plundering. At least that was with the way a lot of Russians viewed the political meaning of IMF lending. I think it was more perversion than diversion of IMF lending, although I think there was some diversion, especially in July, August '98. If one includes the period of the late 80s, when much of this activity was begun under the aegis of the CPSU and the KGB, the representatives of the Soviet state itself, one might guess from $200 to $500 billion of, quote, capital flight, capital loot has left Russia. Now, some of it derived from crime, some of it was completely legitimate, although it was trying to escape taxes. But most of it was in this gray zone derived from phony, crony, insider access to natural and other resources. Now, some of it comes out to be laundered because it needs to be disguised, but a lot of it just gets deposited. It just comes out to where it's safe and productive, and it doesn't stay in Cyprus. It goes to the biggest, most productive, and most accessible economy in the world, the United States of America. Here it goes in several directions. Some stays, takes a nap, as I say, waiting for future opportunities. Some goes back to Russia for business, crime, for politics. A lot of it gets invested in portfolios and real estate and businesses. And I am sure that some of it goes into political contributions. Now, that might seem like an inflammatory statement, but I can make it with confidence because, for three reasons. First, the logic of the situation. That's what this kind of money does. And it's bipartisan. It won't go just to one side of the aisle, because that doesn't make sense. These people don't care about the issues or the values or the politics. They care about influence. A second reason I think I can make this statement is that because there's some examples in the press over the years. And third, because FBI people who follow Russian organized crime in this country have said it's so. It goes on. They don't know quite what to do about it if it doesn't involve direct violation of law, but they have told me that it does. I would assign even greater weight, however, to a more general problem or threat. Money on this scale acquires friends, and those friends have leverage. How much leverage and with what effects on government policies, I do not know, but that's a proper subject for inquiry by this committee. Did Americans heavily invested in the GKO market, this casino, this no-lose casino that eventually became a plundering of the Russian state budget for the benefit of Russian and Western speculators? Vast profits extracted, vast losses risked. Did the stakeholders in that enterprise have influence over U.S. government policy to encourage IMF lending last summer? Mr. Soros and others have strongly implied exactly that. Let me state that the picture, Mr. Chairman, that I've painted here is deliberately unfair because it doesn't afford enough attention to the positive. There is real capitalism and real democracy in Russia. There are decent businesses, there are honest policemen, there are clean politicians. Back to our first point, Russia is stuck, not lost. If the Russians can somehow get through these elections, the crisis of terrorism, create a stable and a somewhat stable and legitimate government, I believe there's a possibility that a real window for reform will reopen. That it can be done right, certainly it can be done better. I hope that we shall be ready with supportive policies that are more perceptive, more honest, and more constructive than they have been in the past. At least we got to quit committing the errors of the past. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.